Good morning. This is inDialog and I'm Jaya. Shashi Tharoor, author, political thinker, and diplomat. Shashi Tharoor has been working for the United Nations since 1978. He is currently the director of the Public Information Department. Prior to that, he was executive assistant to the Secretary General Kofi Annan and also director of communications and special projects. Good morning, Shashi.
Good morning.
Welcome to inDialog.
Good to be here.
Currently, you're temporarily running the Department of Public Information. What exactly is the nature of your work?
Well, I run a department which has the responsibility of putting out the UN's message to the outside world. We have offices in 65 countries around the world, and our staff at headquarters is engaged in everything from producing radio programs for broadcast around the world and TV footage, to running a website which gets 4 million hits a day, to going on with other sorts of public information and public affairs activity to promote specific UN causes, conferences, the special session on AIDS, the recent conference on racism, all of this. In other words, the various kinds of things the UN is engaged in that we need to tell the world about. It's the job of my department to get that word out to the world.
Several people consider the UN as an ineffectual entity. What are your comments on this?
Well, if I believe that, I wouldn't be there. I can tell you that, in fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. It's an extraordinary effort by people from all over the world trying to work collectively to fulfill common aspirations. And if you think of the kinds of things the UN is doing around the world that touch everyone's lives, ranging from keeping people fed in emergency situations, the High Commissioner for Refugees, what UNICEF is doing, everything from polio vaccinations to helping women and children in distress, going all the way to the food delivered by the World Food Programme, even these days, to the starving millions of Afghanistan. And then on the other extreme, you have things like the entire role of the UN in making international civil aviation possible through the International Civil Aviation Organization. For example, it's a UN rule that all pilots and air traffic controllers anywhere in the world have to speak a common language, English. Imagine what would happen if they couldn't or they didn't do that. Would you like to be in a French airliner landing in Thailand if we didn't have that rule? I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which the UN tries to put the world together for common purposes. And I should stress that in some ways, the UN is simply the label we give to the kinds of things we'd have to do together in this globalizing world. And honestly, if we, as the old cliche goes, if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan rings the UN peace bell to initiate an historic event.
This year is a special year, as we observe the first International Peace Day of the Millennium. We are also opening the Millennium Summit.
Well, what are some of the problems you see in the public image of the UN?
Well, it depends on where you're asking the question. In the world at large, our public image is very high. In the US, unfortunately, it's less so because we have a certain number of people on Capitol Hill in particular who've been rather outspoken in their attacks on the UN, which they see as a body that doesn't do much from their point of view for American sovereignty. And this is an impression we've tried to correct through our efforts at explaining what we do. And by and large, I think it's important that we not forget that the United Nations was invented at the end of World War II, precisely because there wasn't a universal body, an effective universal body at the end of World War I. The League of Nations did not include the US, did not include Germany after a certain point, and so World War II became possible. And the US itself took the lead to create the United Nations. To me, the UN is the one indispensable global institution. in today's world. The problems of the world are increasingly what Kofi Annan calls problems without passports, problems across all frontiers and boundaries. And we need an institution that can put the whole world together in finding solutions without frontiers, solutions without visas, or blueprints without borders, one might say. That too is what the UN tries to do, whether it's climate change, whether it's human rights issues, whether it's drug trafficking, money laundering, all these issues which cross frontiers and no one country, however powerful, can handle on its own.
Communities in too many regions of the world now hesitate to look to the United Nations to assist them in the hour of need. No amount of resolutions or statements can change this reality. Only action can. Prompt, united, effective action, pursued with skill and discipline to halt conflict and to restore the peace. Only such determined action can restore the reputation of the United Nations as a credible force for peace and justice.
Shashi, you headed the UN peacekeeping effort in Bosnia. Would you consider that effort to be a success or a failure?
Well, I led the team at headquarters, that is in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, that handled the entire former Yugoslavia, and of course we had a very major operation in the field, which I would keep going back and forth to. But yes, in fact, though we've had a fair amount of criticism for a number of things that went wrong, and we ourselves are amongst the first to point to some of the tragedies that occurred, there is no question that despite whatever may have happened, there are still people alive today in Bosnia, alive and fed and sheltered, who would not be alive if the UN peacekeepers had not been deployed. The failures of the force were a reflection of the fact that the international community had not been able to find the political will to agree on a means of intervening decisively to end that war. The Security Council couldn't agree on doing that, therefore instead they sent in peacekeepers to alleviate the consequences of the war. But it's very difficult for peacekeepers to go in when there is no peace to keep. And that was what led to the difficulties we had. But I still think we made something of a difference, and the proof of that is we've stayed on after the war at the invitation of the Bosnian government to try and help knit together a justice system, to police the local police, to try and promote understanding amongst the communities there, to keep civil officers throughout the country of Bosnia who help stitch together the fabric of that country according to international standards. And I do believe the UN's lingering presence will change the concerns people have had about what went wrong during the war.
Do you think peace enforcement might have made a better, had a better result?
Arguably, but peace enforcement essentially is the same as war making. I mean, what you're talking about is, should we have had peacekeepers where there was no peace, or should we have sent in war fighters, if necessary, to take one side in the war and bring it to an end? Many would argue we should have sent war fighters. Yes, you could call it peace enforcement, forcing people to take, if you like, their own aspirations, political aspirations, and merge them with those of the other parties. In the end, one could argue that's what happened, because it was after an extensive NATO bombing campaign and extensive firing on the ground by the UN's Rapid Reaction Force that the Dayton peace talks were possible and a peace agreement was eventually signed. So we ended up with peace enforcement. You're asking, should we have done it 4 years earlier? Sure, I'm quite willing to say that would have helped had we done that. But I must stress that when, in 1992, the Secretary General was asked by the Security Council whether peacekeeping was possible in Bosnia, he sent his then head of peacekeeping, Sir Merrick Goulding, and me out to the region, and we came back and published a report, which is a public document. It's not something I'm saying with hindsight. It was published in May 1992, saying that peacekeeping would not work in Bosnia, that there was no viable concept the parties could agree to, that the parties were simply not prepared to cooperate with each other and with the UN, and that report is a matter of public record. And yet, despite that recommendation, the Security Council felt they had no alternative but to send the peacekeepers in. I think it's unfair to blame the UN institution for, in the end, the inability of the world at large to agree on taking different sorts of steps to end the war sooner.
What are some of the other peacekeeping successes that the UN engaged in?
Oh, very many of them. If you look at Mozambique, which is happening at exactly the same time, you find we had a civil war just as brutal as Bosnia, with more people actually being killed, the mass rape of women. There was an ethnic cleansing, but there was the cleansing of whole villages. We were able to end that war, disarm the guerrillas, demobilize them, hold free and fair elections and hand over power. In El Salvador, we did little short of transforming the society and politics of that nation. In Cambodia, we brought a brutal civil war to an end, held a fair election, ensured a fair transfer of power. In Namibia, we brought across an entire country to independence. I can give you tons of examples. But the problem is, you know the old cliche that no news is good news. When it comes to UN peacekeeping and the media, it often seems that good news is no news. It's only the bad news that gets reported, and all the good news that I could tell you is news to your readers because they haven't, to your viewers, because they haven't read about this or heard it elsewhere.
Shashi, how long have you known Kofi Annan and in what capacity?
Well, I first met him when he came to UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, an office that I'd been serving since 78. He came to it, if I'm not mistaken, in 79 or 80 in the personnel area. We got to know each other not particularly well, and then I was able to welcome him to the refugee camp in Singapore when I was heading the office there. For most of our HCR careers, we were in different offices, he mainly in headquarters and me mainly in the field. But we knew each other well enough that when I came to New York in October 89 to join Peacekeeping, I made it a point to say hello and inform him I was here. He then moved to Peacekeeping himself in February of 1992, and we were a fairly small office in those days. He was the the Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping, and I was Special Assistant to the Under Secretary General, Mara Goulding. And when a year later Kofi Annan became the Under Secretary General, he asked me to stay on as his Special Assistant. As I was simultaneously leading the team in the former Yugoslavia, which was the largest of his peacekeeping operations, which meant we saw each other more than a dozen times a day, every day, for several years, and became very close professional colleagues as well as friends. When he was elected at the end of 1996 as Secretary General, he asked me to join him in his immediate office, and I worked as his executive assistant and subsequently as his Director of Communications and Special Projects until my coming to DPI at the beginning of this year. So in that sense, I've known him not very well since 1979 and very well since 1992.
In one New York Times article, you mentioned, in one part of my world, I write nothing but India, but in my work, I do nothing on India. Now, the Security Council has 15 members, 5 of which are permanent members. Do you ever see India becoming a permanent part of the Security Council?
Well, the whole business of Security Council reform has been mired in governmental negotiations for 6 years now, and there seems to be no light at the end of the tunnel. You see, for the Council to change, the UN Charter needs to be amended. That requires the affirmative vote of all 5 permanent members, a further affirmative vote of at least 2/3 of the General Assembly, and then ratifications by the parliaments of 2/3 of the member states. We're looking at a long drawn-out process. We haven't even got to first base, that is that governments in the UN have not yet agreed on something that the 5 permanent members in the Security Council could agree to. And at this stage, I think there are so many issues dividing them that it would be an optimist, a fairly foolhardy optimist, who would suggest that a change in the composition of the permanent membership of the Council was likely to be imminent.
With the current alignment of US and Pakistan, what do you think the fallout for India is going to be?
Well, as a UN official, I'm afraid I can't really comment on that directly. I will say one thing, though, which is that certainly all of us hope that one outcome of this entire situation would be a subcontinent that is more stable, more at peace, and less prone to the kind of fundamentalist atmosphere that has generated some of the recent tragedies we know about. So if indeed the closeness of Pakistan and the US leads to a calmer environment, it could also be good for Pakistan and India.
This war against terror that the world is talking about right now, back in 1993 with the World Trade Center bombing, the Bombay Stock Exchange bombing, it was an issue then. Why did the UN not step in at that point? Why is it taken so many years for us to sit up and take note?
It's a very good question. The UN actually has always been extremely underfunded when it came to terrorism issues. We just have 2 people in our office in Vienna working on terrorism. And when the World Trade Center tragedy occurred, the only approach was really to conduct a US investigation because it happened in the US, even though according to the evidence that was found, the UN was the next target they had. Years later, after the bombing of the US embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, the Americans brought to the UN, and the Russians supported them, a resolution demanding that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and imposing sanctions on the Taliban when they failed to do so. That's been going on for a couple of years now. But despite those sanctions, the Taliban have not cooperated, and the UN has not been asked to do more than that. It seems that the scale of what happened on the 11th of September has convinced governments that this is a war that has to be fought internationally through every means at our command: legal, financial, capturing the freezing bank accounts and preventing money laundering and financial havens and tax shelters for these people, and also, frankly, just getting governments together to share information. Because if what we hear is right, we're talking about a network already in 50 to 60 countries. This is not a problem that one country can solve. It's a problem that every country in the world has to contribute to solving. The good news is that the entire General Assembly is united in its condemnation of what happened and its willingness to support this. And if every country provides the necessary information and help, the terrorists will soon find they have no place to hide.
But do you think there is a solution for this war against terrorism? Terrorism going to be completely wiped out, do you think?
Well, we're going to have to see. I mean, I think it's very difficult really to imagine that terrorism can be completely wiped out any more than human illnesses can be completely wiped out. What we can do is try and eradicate specific manifestations of illness. We can beat smallpox, we can beat malaria. We cannot end all illness. And it's possible we cannot end all terrorism, but we can certainly break some networks, apprehend some fugitives from justice, bring them to justice, and we can try perhaps and drain the swamp, as the saying goes, try and prevent new problems from arising. Amongst other things, we've often believed that the work of the UN helps to end the kinds of conditions within which extremist views will flourish. And if that's allowed to happen, we're certainly hopeful that, though we may not be able to eliminate it totally, we can reduce it so that people can lead normal lives without fearing every day, is it safe to go to the supermarket? Will my husband or wife return from work this evening? Can I board a plane? That sort of fear, which we've seen in the US in the course of September 2001, that fear has to end.
Some countries have been named state-sponsored terrorist nations, but yet are preparing to begin terms at the Security Council. Are there no checks and balances instituted in the Security Council to prevent against this?
Well, as a UN official, I cannot speak of the US list. That's something you'll have to ask an American to tell you about. We have no list to the UN of this nature. But what I can tell you is that elections to the Security Council involve every member state of the UN. So if a sufficient number of countries are convinced that a particular candidate for the Security Council does not deserve to be elected, whether because of support for terrorism or any other reason, you can be pretty sure that an effective campaign can be mounted against them. This has happened quite recently, and without wanting to name names, it's widely known that when Mauritius was elected to the Security Council, one of the reasons was a campaign against the original candidate put forward by the African group, which it was felt was sympathetic. So one can certainly look at a number of situations and say, if a country is tarnished in the eyes of the world will not elect it to the Security Council.
There is a discussion of authoritarianism versus democracy in your book, India Midnight to Millennium, and you argue your way towards democracy. Do you ever see a scenario where India would benefit from a less democratic government in place?
No, I don't, because in fact, as in a statement that in fact is very relevant to what some people are talking about today in America as well, a great philosopher once said that those who would trade freedom for security will end up having neither freedom nor security. And I think that essentially is my belief about India as well. Yes, there are enormous problems. Yes, it's fair to ask whether democracy can deliver the goods in a country of so much scarcity and poverty and so on. But the truth is, if you didn't have democracy, the poor would be worse off, because there would be no checks and balances on what could be done to them. As we saw during the emergency, during Mrs. Gandhi's appalling sterilization campaigns, when during these period when our civil liberties were suspended, people could be picked up literally in the bazaars or markets, or for that matter in their places of work, and carted off to get their vasses cut off in a vasectomization campaign. That sort of thing demonstrated vividly, it seems to me, why the old fuddy-duddy concepts of habeas corpus and individual rights and freedom from arrest and so on, why all those things matter so much, and why in the absence of those rights and the absence of freedom of speech to promote and defend those rights, the entire country is far more vulnerable. So to me, you need democracy and you need a certain commitment to change in our country. But don't forget, the great thing about democracy is in a country of such large diversities, it gives everybody an equal chance at attempting to find their place in the sun. Without democracy, what would you do? How would you be able to ensure that the true, authentic representatives of such a varied and diverse people had an opportunity to be elected and to serve their constituents? It would not be easy, and therefore it's very important, it seems to me, to preserve both the democratic political structures and the entire corpus of civil liberties that makes it possible for people to exercise their rights in a democracy.
So you think one of the biggest problems India did face was during the emergency period?
Well, I'm not a fan of the emergency, and I've written about it at great length about my own political maturation during that time, because the emergency was portrayed in some ways as suspending the privileges of the few for the benefit of the many. And as I said in my response to your previous question, in fact, the many were the ones who lost out. And a very, very small elite few clustered around those who were in power were the only beneficiaries of the system and of what happened. So I do feel rather strongly that we should never allow that sort of thing to happen again. The short-term shock therapy effects of locking up opposition and introducing an artificial order in the country very rapidly wear off. And then you're left at the end without freedom, but without the progress that you thought by giving up freedom you were going to get.
But do you marvel at the way Mrs. Gandhi's career went down and then came back up again?
Well, she was certainly very skilled at the acquisition of power. She was a very skilled politician. I'm less impressed by what she did with the power that she had and what good she did for the people of India. I think her legacy has been almost entirely disastrous. And I think that she has left the common man in India no better off for her many years in office. She was in office 11 years the first time, 4 years the second time, 4.5. And I would say those 15.5 years really have been a net minus in the history of India, and that's very sad.